Hi. So I get a lot of questions about Eddie's tuning. I posted a very long forum thread on VH Links. It originally started out on the Metro Amp forum, probably around 2011 or 2012, where I had started finding and notating Eddie Van Halen's tuning offsets, meaning he had specific alternate tunings, so to speak, that he would use throughout all the albums, especially the Roth albums, where every open string is not tuned directly to straight, even chromatic pitch. The strings are off by a few cents here and there, and really more than a few cents. I posted that, and I did that so I could kind of help people understand how to get in tune with the records. To me, being in tune is very important. You really have a much easier time of figuring out what's going on an album if you are in tune with it. And it's also a lot more fun to play along with it once you've learned it, when you're actually really in tune, as close to in tune with the record as you can possibly be, at least as far as physics will allow. So anyway, it gets kind of controversial and people don't understand it, and people get kind of up in arms about it, largely because Eddie did an interview, and one quote in an interview was when he said, "I don't use a tuner," something to the effect of, you can look around here, there's no tuner here, I just pick up my guitar and whatever it's tuned to, I tune to it, and then I have Michael Anthony tuned to me. Well, that may have been true in certain circumstances if Eddie was just jamming around the house or, jamming in the studio. But really, the fact is, if you look at every picture, every backstage picture of Eddie Van Halen from the first tour until his very last live concert appearance, there was a Peterson strobe tuner in every picture backstage. Why is that? Because for many, many years, Eddie just tuned by himself. He tuned his guitars in the tuning room backstage, and there was almost always a Peterson strobe tuner. In fact, there was always a Peterson strobe tuner with Eddie backstage at every show. And he tuned up and just usually used just one guitar for the entire show. And he used tuning offsets. Now, I don't know whether Eddie had specific scent references, and whether he wrote any of them down. I can't even begin to I can't guess really why Eddie did what he did as far as tuning. I can only find that he did use these alternate tunings, and that's what I've done. So, I generally try to avoid asking why he chose to use a certain tuning for one track and a different one on another track. The same tuning gets repeated on the same album on different tracks. The same tuning will be used on different albums. Years down the road, he'll come back to the same tuning. This is what really identifies it as purposeful for me. It wasn't an accidental thing. Eddie knew what he was doing when it came to tuning. I don't know, again, whether he had written down specific scent references that he could then dial in on the Peterson strobe tuner. He could very well, I have the guess that he probably just used his ears and then used the Peterson to fine tune exactly what his ears were telling him. Okay. And that's just a guess, but he definitely used the Peterson strobe tuner live. And I believe he probably used it in the studio as well, because there are specific tunings that go along. So I'm going to read you some kind of notes that I had made with a conversation with a friend of mine who was asking me about the tunings. So I'm just going to read this, and it's kind of long, but it pretty much sums up a lot of what I know about Eddie's tuning. So I say, as I say in my tuning thread, I generally try to avoid asking why Eddie chose to use a certain tuning for one track and a different one on another, or the same on another. I think Runnin' with the Devil, as an example, if you look at the tuning for Runnin' with the Devil that I have in my tuning thread, you can take a very good educated guess as to why he tuned the way he tuned for the album version. And it isn't only to have a pleasing major third interval in the triad chords in the main riff, though that is part of it. you can tell that the natural harmonic runs he does are very pleasing together as well, and they go across the third, second, and first strings as well. I'd say it's a pretty safe bet that he designed the tuning he used so that all parts of the song sound the most pleasing, not just the flattened B string for the pleasing major third. That's kind of a misconception. People think that the only strange thing that Eddie did with tuning was just to flatten the B string for a good sounding beatless major third. But it was far beyond that. Even the pedal steel licks and the two-note chords on the high E and B strings sound pleasing during the solos. About the only thing that sounds out of tune in the whole recording of Runnin' with the Devil from the album is the open high E when you do the backwards strummed E minor chord down at the nut leading into the choruses. But that one note is kind of covered up, so to speak. He doesn't repeat this tuning for any other recording. So you know that the tuning for the album version of Runnin' with the Devil is definitely a specialized tuning for that song only. Now that's an unusual thing because more often Eddie would use a specific tuning and then use it on other songs, like again on the same album or different albums in the catalog. But for Runnin' with the Devil, he did use just one specific one. So I'll say that there are, like say on the first album, there's some tunings that he went to that were basically repeated and also repeated on Van Halen 2. So that tuning I like to call a home base tuning. It's a tuning which he used live, and it's also a tuning that he returned to on the albums, as I say. He may have only slightly detuned the B for early live versions of Runnin' with the Devil, but he basically used that one tuning. And again, that goes back to him being backstage and tuning the guitar by himself, not having a tech do it. Eddie did it himself and then walked out on stage with that guitar, and he generally played the one guitar for the entire show. Let's see. And so a lot of people think that that's all he did on, was to detune the B for Runnin' with the Devil, but it's obvious when you look at the tuning offset that I found that there's a lot more going on than that. As we can tell from the backstage photos from the first tour, and for a long while afterward, he tuned his one guitar, or sometimes two guitars, the black and white Frankenstein and the Shark, or later on, he played just the red, black, and white striped version of the Frankenstein with the Fender trim and the black and yellow Charvel with the Floyd Rose. He did all this backstage by himself, not Rudy, his tech, or none of his later techs. Later on, probably around the time that Zeke Clark got in to be his tech was when I believe Eddie started really having other people tuning his instruments, because there were more instrument changes, different keyboard songs. So I think he kind of got used to having the techs actually do the tuning. So for instance, on the first tour, he would have played the whole show on just the Frankenstein, and then he'd finish the Eruption and grab the Shark Destroyer for You Really Got Me. So just about every tour bears this out. Even on 1984, he only changed guitars once for I'll Wait, and he played the whole show on the 5150 Kramer, unless there was like a broken string, requiring him to pick up another guitar, like another backup Kramer. With all that said, I don't know why he chose to do a completely different tuning for, say, I'm the One versus On Fire on the album. I can only guess that he had his reasons for whatever track he was recording. I ultimately don't care why he used these tunings, but I do care about pointing out that he did use tuning offsets and finding, notating, and sharing what those exact offsets were. It's more important to me to be in tune with the recording so that learning and playing along with them is a lot more fun and accurate. So that's kind of what drove me to start figuring out these tunings. And just to give some logic, I often include the James Taylor video that discusses tuning. If you look on YouTube, there's a video, just type in James Taylor tuning, and there's a video where James Taylor describes exactly how he uses tuning offsets. And that's a good general overview of why tuning offsets are used and why they matter and why they help. And I'll include a link to that in this clip. So he basically, here's an idea of why the tuning offsets occur. Essentially, the A and D strings already have pleasing intervals between each other. So you should notice that most of the tunings that I've notated that Eddie used have an equivalent sant reference. They're in tune equally with each other. They're not off balance with each other, the A and D strings. The B often needs to be flattened more, so you'll see that reflected in most of Ed's tuning offsets. The high E then needs to be adjusted to work as well with that slightly lowered B string while maintaining a tolerable difference in sound reference between it, the high E, and fretted notes on the D and G string, for example. And then the low E is almost always tuned to the identical scent reference as the open high E. Ed's more home bass tuning offsets follow this basic pattern. But again, this is to do with the thickness of the strings, the intervals, and how they behave on different strings. Some of it is to do with finger pressure on the fatter low E string, for example. These are all likely contributors to the logic behind, what tuning offsets he chose. But even in James Taylor's video, James makes it kind of clear that you don't really even need to think about why it's being done, only that it works and it sounds better. James says, just try it. You might like it. You might notice that your guitar sounds much more in tune with itself and it sounds much better. And again, just to restate, it's not only Eddie that did this. Many, many, many great guitar players did this, using the use of tuning offsets, and many of them used a good quality strobe tuner. There are pictures of Dwayne Allman using the Peterson strobe tuner, Jimmy Page using the Kahn strobe tuner, lots of people, Leslie West. There's so many people, classic rock guitar players that use tuning offsets. There's, tuning to straight chromatic pitch, can work, but it just sounds better when you use an offset tuning. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I learned, when I was a kid trying to figure out songs, and I didn't have a tuner, so I'd have to just use my ear to tune to the albums. And I realized quickly that the albums that I was listening to were not in tune with any straight chromatic pitch. You just had to tune to what the record was, and each string wasn't perfectly in tune with each other according to chromatic pitch. So basically, I can kind of give you a story of, how I started figuring out this stuff. So I only tuned by ear to recordings, as I said. I tried getting a tuner. I got a Korg DT1 digital tuner. Those things were terrible. They came out in the 80s. I quickly realized that tuning to straight chromatic pitch would assure that I would never be able to learn from Van Halen or any other artist. I tried the Boss TU-12 needle tuner, even worse. I couldn't use those tuners to tune to straight chromatic pitch and be anywhere near in tune with what was going on the records. And again, it's not just because of tape speed manipulation. The entire pitch of the entire guitar is not raised or lowered. It's really about the individual strings being out of chromatic tune with each other. That's what an offset is. It's when the six strings are in a deliberate out of tuneness with each other, so that the intervals are pleasing to your ear up and down the fretboard, or just for specific chords and specific licks. So basically, you can make the guess that almost every great classic rock player was tuned to something other than straight chromatic pitch. When I was a kid, I tuned to records and I went all over the fretboard testing notes and intervals, natural harmonics versus fretted notes, the same notes in different locations everywhere. And I quickly found by ear alone, this is before I got a Peterson tuner, which wasn't until the late 2000s when the Peterson HD strobe tuner came out, that I have right there. It was the first affordable one. A good Peterson strobe tuner cost upwards of $1,000 throughout the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. So it wasn't until, when the Peterson virtual strobe tuners started coming out that they became affordable. And those are the only really, truly best, most accurate tuners on the market. If I've looked at the other ones that claim to be as accurate or more accurate. They're not. The Peterson is the most accurate, and it's demonstrable, and there's data to back that up. Other people claim a certain accuracy to within a certain range, but they don't have any data to back it up, and Peterson does. And I don't even really need to know that. I just know that every great rock guitar player pretty much uses a Peterson tuner, and most every competent guitar technician in the world has one on their bench. They work. Plain and simple. So I quickly found, by doing this kind of method of tuning all over, checking all the notes all over the fingerboard and making sure that certain intervals were as close to in tune with each other as they could be. It was a compromise. So I came up with I basically started, I didn't know anything about offsets. At the time, I just started calling it compromised tuning. So with these compromised tuning, these notes could be as in tune as possible with each other all over the fingerboard. I really got good at this when I started working with bands and in my acoustic duo act in the late 90s and early 2000s. I used capos and worked up a lot of cover songs with my singer. And some of these songs were originally piano-based songs. In fact, we did a version of Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road, which is a piano tune essentially. I came up with a one guitar arrangement of that song that contained most of the piano parts with some voice leading throughout the whole piece. This forced me to get in tune all over the fretboard and to get as in tune as possible while taking the capo into account, because I used a capo on that song. So you really have to do a compromise offset tuning to make that work when you're playing all over the fingerboard, especially when you're doing a lot of chords all over the fingerboard, very high up and very low down at the nut and all over. What was I doing when I was going through these different pitch checking processes? And I was basically coming up with my own compromise tuning. That was the best that I could do. I didn't know it was an offset tuning, but I just called it a compromise tuning. So basically, I believe that Eddie probably did the same thing. He did a lot of time in his youth figuring out songs from records. He probably could have learned about the concept of offset tunings from his father. Offset tunings are the way that pianos are tuned. So really, any classically trained musician knows this. It's not an unusual thing. It's really a common thing in stringed instruments. And after all, piano is a stringed instrument. He could have learned this from his father. He could have learned this from a guitar technician at his local music store. I got some confirmation from that when my guitar technician back in the 80s, guy still works on my guitars to this day. He let me use his Peterson strobe tuner and he taught me how to use it. And, he kind of confirmed my suspicion that, basically guitars are imperfect instruments, and just like pianos, and you have to tune them to something other than just straight chromatic pitch, or else they'll sound terrible across the whole fingerboard. He basically explained that my suspicions were right. He just kind of confirmed what my ears were already telling me. The same notes have different actual pitches at different places on the fretboard, and the natural harmonics are even more variable than fretted and open notes. It's all a big soup, and you have to just make a compromised tuning to get in tune as close as physics will allow. By compromising and tuning these notes to be equally out of tune or out of chromatic pitch with each other as possible, so that they basically work the best that they can. They're not rubbing against each other in an unpleasing way. And you can't get it exact. You just have to kind of split the difference. And that's, what compromised tuning or offset tuning is all about. I'm fairly certain that this was Eddie's experience. Like I say, he probably just figured this out from learning from records. But, as I said, pianos are tuned this way, generally by people with extremely good ears, and often in conjunction with their ears, they use a Peterson strobe tuner to tune the piano. Classical guitarists have been doing this since the beginning of the instrument, too. Somehow this concept got completely lost on most average rock guitar players, especially in the 80s. This might be because eventide harmonizers and chorus units smoothed out the unpleasant rub of these intervals to a degree. Also in the 80s, a lot of hair bands would play power chord rhythms and single note leads. This is not as much of a test of tuning across the entire fingerboard as, say, what I was doing with, using one guitar to play a bunch of piano parts and playing chords all up and down the neck. Where you have a lot of different intervals going on and you're using more than just power chords. That's kind of a theory. I don't know really exactly why people, kind of lost this concept of using offset tunings, but thankfully I think some people are starting to learn it. I'm really kind of shocked that more people don't know about the concept of offset tunings, and really it's just with Eddie, he had a good ear. He came up with these offset tunings. I don't care to know how or why he did it, really. I just know that he did it. So I, use my ear. I use the strobe tuner to dial in the exact pitches. Basically I'll sit with the recording and, I'll play along. I can hear the notes within a chord. I can hear the individual natural harmonics when he strikes a natural harmonic. and I tune to that by ear, and then I zero in on the actual pitch using the strobe tuner. The strobe tuner tells me exactly how many cents it's off in one direction or another. And then I do that for all 6 strings. And then I just record that. I write it down, and then I've been sharing it on the Peterson website, and I share it on VH links. I typically will update that thread, and again, I'll post that thread in the description section of this video. So anyway, sorry, it's a super long rambling video, but I wanted to give an explanation of the tuning process that Eddie used and how I came about it, and some kind of loose definitions of what an offset tuning does, what it is, and why people use it, and why Eddie used it. You know, again, why is not the question. He just did use it. Try them out. You really need to have a good Peterson strobe tuner in order to be able to get to these pitches, these exact pitches, because the accuracy of the tuner and really the ease of use, you can just dial it right in. In fact, you can plug in your Peterson strobe tuner and download all the tunings that I've uploaded to Peterson's site, and it'll just throw it right on your tuner. You don't even have to think about it. You put on one of the tunings that I found, tune your guitar up to it. And one last thing, to be certain, your guitar has to be tuned in chromatic straight pitch when you do the intonation setting. When you do the setup, when you're setting the intonation on the guitar, you have to use straight chromatic pitch. But after you've got your guitar set up, dialed in, nut filed perfectly, whatever the case may be, you've got your guitar set up, has to be set up and tuned and intonated to chromatic pitch. Once you have that done, you can basically repeat any of these tuning offsets on any guitar, and you'll be in tune with the record. Okay? Hopefully that answers a lot of questions that people have been asking. Sorry for the long rambling video, but I did want to give a good explanation of it. Cheers. Thanks, guys.